So this is the first of 4 sessions, introducing you to an analytic strategy for critical analysis called What's the Problem Represented to Be? Or the WPR approach for the sake of simplicity. You will be introduced to some rather complex theory in these sessions. I hope that you won't be daunted, and I will be returning to specific themes to clarify difficult issues over the 4 sessions. Now, an earlier version of the WPR approach appears in my 1999 book called Women, Policy and Politics, The Construction of Policy Problems. In that book, the approach was applied to specific policy areas associated with what was called women's inequality. Since then, the WPR approach has been elaborated in Analyzing Policy, What's the Problem Represented to Be? And there it is applied to a wide range of policy areas, including welfare policy, migration policy, criminal justice policy, equality policy, and education policy. I'm happy to say it's now available as an e-book. The WPR approach consists of 6 interconnected questions and an undertaking to apply those questions to your own recommendations or proposals. You have copies of the questions in front of you. The short version, the abbreviated version, appears in Analyzing Policy on page 12, Roman numerals of the introduction, and again on page 2 of chapter 1. The elaborated version, that's the one on the dark print, that includes some of the theoretical concepts that are involved in the different questions, and that appears on page 48 of chapter 2. Now, the approach was initially developed as a tool for critical policy analysis. But the approach can be applied to many different kinds of material. The primary focus in these sessions will be on public policy, but it's not a public policy course. Many people in other disciplines engage with aspects of public policy. And you will find, therefore, that the approach is useful even if you do not consider yourself to be a public policy person. Indeed, the questions are the kinds of questions that critical scholars have been asking for a very long time. They constitute a form of thinking, critical thinking. Here's a brief list of areas where the approach has already been applied, and we'll look more closely at these possibilities for application in the second session. So, pieces of legislation, government reports, governmental technologies such as administrative forms, application for the dole, censuses, theories and concepts, websites and other forms of text, media reports, advertisements, and interviews as texts. The benefit of the WPR approach is that it can assist you in formulating and organizing a major research project, such as a PhD project. It can also be put forward as a methodology, both for research projects and for PhD projects. You know that section when they ask, what is your methodology? It has been accepted that you can say that you are using this approach as a methodology. I think this helps to explain the growing popularity of the approach with PhD students and other researchers in many countries. Now, please note the approach is intended to be a tool or a resource. It is not a formula. That is, it can be adapted to your particular needs. I show in Analyzing Policy, for example, that you can apply it systematically, a question at a time. We'll be going through all the questions shortly and in the second session. In chapters 3 and 4, then you can see what each question produces. When applied in that way, it's also clear that they're interconnected questions, so there are overlaps. As a result, I have developed what I call an integrated analysis in the later chapters, where the questions aren't explicitly stated. They kind of sit in the background. Now, in those chapters, you'll be able to see where I applied the questions, because I put question 1, question 2, whatever. But if you're doing your analysis, there's no need for you to do that. Nor is it necessary to adopt all of the questions all of the time. It depends on your purposes. I do, however, stress the importance of applying the 6 questions to your own proposals in all cases. That is, the undertaking at the list of 6 questions to apply the questions to your own proposals. I'll be explaining why in due course. So in the second session, I'll be going through the approach question by question, step by step. For now, I want to give you the flavor of the approach, its goals, and some of the influences that shaped it. That is, where it sits in relation to contemporary social theory and where it sits in relation to other forms of policy analysis. The WPR approach rests upon a simple idea. What we propose to do about something reveals what we think needs to change, and hence what we think is problematic or what the problem is. I'll repeat that because it's really foundational to the approach. What we propose to do about something reveals what we think needs to change, and hence what we think is problematic, what we think the problem is. I'm going to start with a very mundane, real-world example. Imagine for a moment that you are the owner of a gymnasium and your water bills are skyrocketing. If you call in a plumber, you are saying that what you think is problematic is something to do with leaking pipes. What you propose to do about something reveals what you think needs to change. If, by contrast, you decided to put water timers on the showers so that the showers cut out after 3 minutes, okay, you are saying that what you think needs to change, what you think the problem is the overindulgence of your clientele, right? That's just a real-world, mundane example to give you the feel for the thinking. What you propose to do about something reveals what you think the problem is. That simple idea marks the novelty of the approach. It offers a way to open up policies to a specific kind of critical interrogation. So I'll give you now a couple of policy examples. Let's look at training programs for women. A common reform proposal to improve women's representation in positions of influence and in better paying jobs is to offer them training programs. Right? It happens all the time. If training programs is the proposal, is the proposed solution, then clearly it is assumed that women's lack of training is the problem. Right? So using that simple idea, working backwards, if that is the proposal, then that is the assumption. Let us also think about the currently much discussed obesity problem. If the proposal is some sort of an activity regime for children, for example, a few years ago, there was an Australian government advertisement, some of you might remember it, where children were watching television on this rather large couch. And then the couch becomes animated and shoots them into space, and they all run outdoors and start playing cricket and whatever, right? So that's a proposal. That's a proposal about what needs to be done to combat childhood obesity. If that is the proposal, the problem is represented to be children's inactivity. Okay? By contrast, think if the proposal were to ban advertising of fast foods during primetime television for children. If that is the proposal, you can see that there's a completely different understanding of what the problem is. In that instance, the problem is deemed to be perhaps aggressive or even overly aggressive advertising. So the argument is that you can read off how the problem is represented from examining the proposal or proposed solution. Now, sometimes I use other words. I say you can work backwards. You can start with the proposal and then see how the problem is being represented by looking back into it. Or you can read off. So both of those languages I use. In both cases, what I'm saying is that how the problem is represented is implicit within the proposal. It's not outside the proposal. How the problem is understood is implicit within the proposal. I refer to how the problem is represented as a problem representation. Right? That's on your glossary, which you have, and that's one of the key terms in the approach. Now, I'd like to emphasize the usefulness of this way of thinking about proposals or policies, though it may not be immediately apparent. In fact, you might say that reading off the problem from the proposed solution doesn't appear to tell us much at all. That is, to say that a proposal to train women produces women's lack of training as the problem appears to be a truism. But I'm going to suggest that this starting point, which is all that it is, can revolutionize the way you look at policies and at a whole range of other things. So I'd ask you just to take a moment to think of a policy area that interests you and think of a specific kind of proposal that is being made in the field. Once you've got that in your head, see if you can read off the implicit problem representation just by looking at the proposal. Hold that thought. Now, in the early stages of developing the approach, I was influenced by the work of Michael Shapiro. And I'm going to offer a couple of his examples to start us thinking about the potential richness of the simple idea that I've just introduced. Though Shapiro's examples are not exact applications of the approach. One of Shapiro's examples is about Aboriginal health policy. He looks at a 1972 Australian policy statement on Aboriginal health in the Northern Territory. They were looking into the issue of child mortality, the high incidence of child mortality. The policy paper, and this is a quote, identified as what needs to change the semi-nomadic life of some of the Aborigines. So here, the problem is stated, it's represented to be Aboriginal people's way of life, their semi-nomadic life. And the implication, the solution, was that they ought to alter their lifestyle, right? They ought to settle down. Now, a social scientist who was not under contract to the government offered an alternative representation of the problem. He said, quote, "Instead of emphasis being placed on Aboriginal failure to assimilate to our norms, which was that first representation of the problem. It should rather be on our failure to devise strategies that accommodate to their folkways. Right? Now, this proposal locates the problem in the inflexibility of Australian health services at the time, rather than in the reluctance of Aboriginal people to change. Okay, so I'm just giving you these examples to get us thinking about what we can do with this approach. Shapiro's second example is traffic congestion, one of our favourite topics in Adelaide. The common policy responses to the problem of traffic congestion are practical solutions. They usually make the headlines in the Advertiser. We have overpasses, we have underpasses, we have tram lines, we have freeways. Shapiro asks us to consider what follows if we broaden our analysis to think about traffic congestion as a middle-class problem, produced by people who have enough money to purchase one or more cars and the funds to fuel them. So in this view, traffic congestion is not something to be reduced. It's something to be rethought, reconceptualized. This kind of analysis can easily be transferred to recent concerns about carbon emissions and global warming, and certainly complicates attempts to blame newly industrializing countries for the phenomenon. The question becomes, how can we get from that basic idea, that simple idea that I've introduced, to read off problem representations from proposals, to the kind of critical analysis that Shapiro offers? The answer? We need more questions. We need more questions. And this is exactly what the WPR approach offers. It offers 5 more questions to probe, to interrogate, to analyze the problem representations that we identify through question 1. And those questions and the undertaking to apply them to your own proposals I have saved for the second session. Because before we do that, I would like us to have a better idea of the goals behind the WPR approach, its objectives, and the influences that produced it. The overriding purpose of the approach is to reflect on how we are governed, how governing takes place, how we are produced as governable subjects within governing practices, and with what implications for those who are so produced. These are not the only critical questions that need to be asked, but they are important ones. Now, governing and politics is understood here in a very broad sense. We are not limiting ourselves to conventional political institutions and party politics. Rather, we are concerned with how order is maintained, how society runs, how it's administered. So our focus is on factors that include the state, but that extend beyond the state. We examine the diversity and the plurality of authorities that seek to govern our conduct. And that includes professionals, experts, academics, social workers, administrators. So think how society runs, how it's administered, and all of the influences in making that happen. That is our field, that is our scope. So here the approach reflects the influence of authors such as Peter Miller, Nicholas Rose, Mitchell Dean, Barry Hindus, Thomas Osborne, and it's associated with the concept of governmentality, about which we will hear more in due course. In this broad approach to governing, so when I say this broad approach, it means that that's what I meant when I said it's not a public policy course in the strict sense of the term. Right? We are moving beyond conventional political institutions. In this broad approach to governing, the whole meaning of policy requires a degree of rethinking. As Miller and Rose contend, the conventional notion of policy fits within a particular understanding of the role of government. That is, policy is conceived of conventionally as a tool of governments to redress what needs fixing up in society, to redress the problems in society, always in inverted commas. Now, I call this conventional approach to governing a reactive approach. A reactive approach. Because it's based on the assumption that governments react to fixed and identifiable societal problems and that they do their best to resolve them. Now, that's the way we're used to thinking about both the role of government and the role of policy. So it's hard to start thinking about it somewhat differently. I'll just show you an example. I don't mean to pick on this particular author, but this is a classic example of that perspective. Public policy addresses societal problems and is about what governments do, why they do it, and what difference it makes. So you have a view of what government does, and you have a view of policy as addressing problems which are out there. And usually when we elect a government, that's the way we think of what they're doing. Right? They're going to fix the problems, hopefully. So this is a very entrenched view. By contrast, I develop a quite different view. That governments, and indeed all of us, give a particular shape to problems, to social problems, in the ways in which we speak about them and in the proposals that we advance to so-called address them. So in this understanding, governments are active in the creation of problems. They are active in the creation or production of problems as particular types of problems. So rather than addressing them or trying to solve them, they produce them. Policy cannot get to work without first problematizing its territory. Problematizing its territory. What he means is that in order to do things, to intervene, governments have to target something as a problem that needs fixing. So they are involved in the practice of problematization. Specific policy interventions show how the problem is being understood and created. Note, I'm not saying that governments are involved in the business of producing poverty or homelessness. All right? Rather, I'm saying that governments, through proposals, produce poverty or homelessness or whatever as a particular sort of problem because of the way in which it is problematized through the policy interventions. And these problematizations become part of how we are governed. Right? The way in which the problem is produced within a specific policy is part of how we are governed, and that's our question, how are we governed? So I say rather provocatively that we are governed through problematizations rather than through policies. We're governed through the ways in which policies produce an understanding of the problem. Now, there's no suggestion that this is a deliberate exercise designed to mystify citizens. The WPR approach is not intended as a means to study manipulative politicians, though these doubtless exist. Rather, it shows how proposals necessarily, simply by virtue of their function, create or produce problems as problems of a particular sort. Hence, you can say that the WPR approach is an attempt to understand policy better than policymakers. Now, I want to say something about the notion of problem representations. You'll remember that I said that's a key term in the approach, that you can see the problem representation implicit within the policy. Well, that can lead to some misunderstanding, so we'll just take a moment on that. Some researchers tend to treat these problem representations as simply competing interpretations, or they sometimes use the language of problem definitions, or they suggest that I'm talking about rhetoric, political rhetoric, with governments and politicians portraying issues in particular ways to suit their purposes. As I've just mentioned, the WPR approach is not concerned with conscious intentions. It's not designed for that kind of study. Rather, I emphasize how problem representations themselves are political interventions because they affect how we are governed. Right? They have effects in the way we live our lives. The problem representations have those effects. So they are interventions. As Shapiro says, representations do not imitate reality, but are the practices through which things take on meaning and value. Okay, so they are not imitations of the real. They are how the real becomes real. So I say a problem representation is the way in which a particular policy problem is constituted in the real. This term constitute or constituted or constitutive features widely in this form of analysis. It means that things are made to come into existence without deliberate intent through practices. Okay, so when we say something has been constituted, has been made to come into existence. Things are produced into being through practices. In some fields, as we'll see, they use the word enacted. Okay, things are enacted into existence. In each case, whether you use the language of constituted or produced, created or enacted, the proposition is that lives are lived in specific ways due to the shaping impact of proposals that constitute problems as particular kinds of problems. That's how they are interventions. They are political problem representations, are practices that produce the real. They produce how we live. That's why I say we're actually governed through problematizations. Now, this idea is developed in some of my more recent work on a concept called ontological politics. And you can see that in the 2012 articles on your reading list. And here I have found the work of Anne-Marie Moll useful. Her book is called The Body Multiple, written in 2002. Moll argues that we live in a world characterized by a proliferation of practices, things going on all the time, and that practices produce realities. So we have multiple practices, we have multiple realities. She says, well, if that's the case, how do we end up with this impression that there is a singular reality? This is reality. Where does that come from? Moll says that the real is produced through what she calls practices of coordination that enact, she uses the language of enact, particular singular realities as the real. So these practices of coordination are very, very important in producing what we come to call reality. And she highlights the role of research as a coordinating practice. So research is involved in producing the real, involved in producing what is called reality. Through her analysis, she is highlighting the necessarily political character of research. And that is an assumption within this approach, and that is that research is a political activity. Provocatively, Moll says that when postgraduate students come to see her to find a research topic, she suggests that they consider not what they want to know, but what they want to do. What they want to achieve, what they want to change. So that just highlights the notion of research as political practice. Moll, as you can see, is associated with John Law and actor network theory and with science, technology, and society studies. And that makes a major contribution to thinking in these areas. The key point that problem representations are part of the practices of coordination that constitute the real is exactly the stance defended in what is called, apparently paradoxically, non-representation theory. And this is an important development in human geography. So I'm just going to use a quote from Anderson and Harrison to give you a different take on the idea that I've been developing, because I like the way they put it. They say, as things and events, they, representations, enact worlds. Right? So you see that language of enactment there, and worlds, rather than being simple go-betweens tasked with representing some pre-existing order or force. Okay, so they're not just go-betweens between there's the real and here's representation. In their taking place, that term taking place, as you can see, appears in their title, they have an expressive power as active interventions in the co-fabrication of worlds. Right? So representations, therefore, are political interventions. And I do like that phrase, the co-fabrication of worlds. Now, this example from human geography illustrates that the kind of thinking introduced in the WPR approach is well established in a range of disciplines. As I said, it's based on the kinds of questions that critical scholars have been asking for some time. It also confirms how important it is to study the problem representations that we identify by asking question 1, as we will see. Since they play such a crucial role in our lives, we are governed through the ways in which problems are represented. In my 2012 paper called Why Study Problematizations, I point out that Foucault uses the term problematization in 2 ways. He has a nasty habit of doing that, of using terms with more than one meaning. The 2 ways are, the first meaning, to refer to his method of critical analysis, which he describes as thinking problematically. I can't help thinking this is a translation thing, or that he was being cheeky, but thinking problematically means, it's the more common use of the word to problematize. When we say, oh, I'm going to problematize something, I'm going to rethink it, right? So that's that first meaning of the word. And the second meaning is to refer to the ways in which objects are formed or are constituted through practices. The WPR approach draws on both of these understandings of Foucault and of problematization. We're going to look at the second meaning first. Foucault uses problematization in this second meaning to de-ontologize things. Right? To de-ontologize, to take away their reality status. He applied it to all things, his concepts of power, the subject, ideas. He's a nominalist in the sense that for Foucault, things that we take for granted as entities are simply the names that we put on things. Right? They are named creations or social constructions. For example, in his study of madness, he argues that madness did not exist as an object for thought outside of the practices that constituted it. He says that to see how the mad came to be seen as a particular kind of entity, we need to look at those practices. We need to look at how they were treated. A quote, how they were set aside, excluded from society, interned and treated. He argues that by examining what people did, by examining the practices, you can see how madness was thought about. Or you can see how madness was problematized. By looking at the practices, you can see problematization taking place. This term came into his work a bit late in the piece, but it seems that he believes that it underpinned his earlier work as well. All right? It's his way of wanting to find out how thinking takes place. And he says what you need to do is you need to see how people problematize. And he says the way to do that is to look at their practices. So by treating the mad in a particular way, you can see how they're thinking about the mad. And then because they're thinking about the mad in that particular way, they become the mad. Madness becomes something that then people talk about. It's an object for thought that has been produced through practices. So the same can be said to apply to the whole range of governed objects that we deal with. Delinquency, out-of-wedlock births, welfare, population, binge drinking, problem gambling. These governmental categories, which we commonly think of as entities, as things, are produced through the very practices that create them as categories, including practices of comparison and practices of measurement. All right, so if you need to understand, to gain access to problematizations, you need to look at practices. So Foucault says, let's look at practical texts. Practical texts. It's a key term in his work, and it's one that I adopt. What he means are things like regulations and decrees, would include legislation, government reports. Okay, that's a way of getting access to practices. These are key sites where governmental objects are produced in the way that I've just described. Just as you could see how the mad were treated in how they were treated in practices, you can look at how we are treated in rules, regulations, etc. So by examining practical texts, you can see how we are problematized, and hence how we are produced as particular kinds of subjects, how we are constituted as welfare recipients, de facto spouses, asylum seekers, higher education students. Okay? These are not entities, these are creations through practices. So in the WPR approach, policies and policy proposals are treated as practical texts in this sense. And attention is directed to their constitutive effects, what they make come into existence, what they produce as the real. I draw on Foucault's thinking on problematization as producing objects for thought, but I do something different with it. Foucault tended to focus on what he called crisis moments, times when there were dramatic changes from one problematization to another. For example, from about 1791, a vast array of penal methods were replaced by incarceration. That attracted his interest, his attention, because you could examine different forms of problematization going on. I argue that every policy is a problematization, that you don't have to look for crisis moments, that every policy is a problematization, and every policy contains an implicit problem representation. How so? Through the simple idea that I introduced at the outset, that what we propose to do about something indicates what we think is problematic and what needs to change. It's a problematizing gesture. So since policy proposals specify what needs to change, they are problematizations. Problematization is going on in every policy. As already noted, we are governed through these problematizations and the problem representations that they contain. That's why they're so important. If we want to see how we are governed, we need to be able to examine those problematizations and the problem representations that they contain. We need to tease out and interrogate those problem representations. This leads to three conclusions. Every policy is a problematization and contains an implicit problem representation. I'm hoping that that language is now a bit clearer. We are governed through problematizations rather than through policies. Therefore, we need to study problematizations through analyzing the problem representations that they contain. How are we going to do this? How are we going to study problematizations and the problem representations they contain? We need more questions. We need additional questions. WPR approach gives us 5 questions to do that task, to get stuck in to those problem representations so that we can see what's going on in how we are being governed. Now, these questions take up Foucault's first meaning of problematization, which you might recall is to think problematically, to query, to scrutinize, to problematize. So basically, what we are doing in this approach is we are problematizing, we are scrutinizing the problem representations that we uncover. Okay, so we're applying both meanings of problematization. And that is the task that we will look at in the second session. We're going to look at how the other questions in the approach, you have them in front of you, how they do this. What kind of insights can they give us into how we are governed through opening up these problem representations to critical analysis? I've given you some idea of the types of theory which have influenced the development of the WPR approach. I've mentioned specifically Shapiro, Foucault, actor network theory. The approach also draws on social construction theory and ontological politics, post-structural theory, including feminist post-structural psychology, governmentality studies, and feminist body theory. From social construction theory, a WPR approach accepts that things that we often take for granted as true or real are products of particular times and places. They are socially produced. Knowledge is considered to be a social product. Hence, you will see I use the plural, knowledges, which gives my computer all sorts of difficulties. It's constantly underlining it in red, which says a lot. Right? The word knowledges kind of causes a problem here. Moll's work on ontological politics takes the social construction thinking a step further. She insists that we not see social constructions as permanent or solid, but as always in process, so the emphasis on change. Realities in this perspective are conceived to be enacted in ongoing formation, and hence as always political. There is a link here to post-structuralism, which insists on the politics involved in assigning meaning to terms and practices. The primary focus in post-structuralism is on the contestable nature of what becomes the real, what becomes reality. From governmentality studies, there is an interest in governing practices broadly conceived, including but going beyond the state, to encompass the groups that we mentioned earlier, professionals, experts, academics, social workers, etc. And an interest in the thought behind such governing practices, which will be developed in a later session. From feminist body theory, there is an insistence that the material or the lived effects of problem representations have to be included in any analysis. Problem representations are interventions that shape realities. They have lived effects, and they need to be interrogated at that level. So the WPR approach is to be distinguished from some other policy approaches, and this is a bit of a summary. It challenges conventional approaches to policy analysis that see the goal of policy as solving problems, as if problems exist outside the process waiting to be addressed. Note, the WPR approach does not deny that conditions such as poverty, homelessness, domestic violence exist, but that as soon as they are targeted through policy, they become specific sorts of problems. I describe conventional approaches to policy analysis as reactive because policy is seen as a reaction to pre-existing problems that are outside, exogenous to the process. By contrast, I describe policy in the WPR approach as, all those words, as productive, creative, constitutive of problems. Not surprisingly, therefore, the WPR approach challenges approaches that are described as problem-solving, which everybody wants to talk about these days, eh? Problem-solving approaches. So it raises real questions about problem-solving, as it does about evidence-based policy studies, which also take as a starting place an assumed problem. It challenges positivist approaches that accept a realist ontology and a correspondence theory of knowledge, including critical realist approaches. It has a different focus from interpretive approaches to policy analysis that draw attention to contextualized self-interpretations, how people make sense of what's going on around them. or to interpretive communities. It has a different focus from those due to a basic difference of opinion about how the political subject is conceptualized in the WPR approach. And there will be more on that in the next session. For similar reasons, it distances itself from deliberative policy analysis, influenced by Habermas, which focuses on argumentation and persuasion. And finally, it stands at some distance from frame theory that focuses on an individual's cognitive maps, and also from critical frame analysis, because of their primary focus on policy actors and their roles in defining problems and solutions.